capitalism based on self-ownership. Murray Rothbard, a leading libertarian capitalist, claims that capitalism is based on the basic axiom of the right to self-ownership. This axiom is defined as the absolute right of each man to control his or her body free of coercive interference. Since each individual must think, learn, value, and choose his or her ends and means in order to survive and flourish, the right to self-ownership gives man the right to perform these vital activities without being hampered by coercive molestations from foreign liberty. At first, this appears to sound reasonable, but we own ourselves and consequently we decide what we do with ourselves has an intuitive appeal. Surely this is liberty. Thus, in this perspective, liberty is a condition in which a person's ownership rights in his own body and his legitimate material property are not invaded, are not aggressed against. It also lends itself to contrast with slavery, where one individual owns another, and the slave has little or no right to self-ownership. His person and his produce are systematically expropriated by his master by the use of violence. Rothbard. This means that self-ownership can be portrayed as the opposite of slavery. We have the dominion over ourselves that a slave owner has over their slave. That means that slavery is wrong because the slave owner has stolen the rightful property of the slave, namely the body and its related abilities. This concept is sometimes expressed as people having a natural or inalienable right to own their own property and the product of their own labor. Anarchists, while understanding the appeal of the idea, are not convinced that self-ownership, like slavery, places issues of freedom and individuality within the context of private property. As such, it shares the most important claim of slavery, namely that people can be objects of the rules of private property. It suggests an alienated perspective and, moreover, a fatal flaw in the dogma. This can be seen from how the axiom is used in practice. Inasmuch the term self-ownership is used simply as a synonym for individual autonomy, anarchists do not have an issue with it. However, the basic axiom is not used in this way by the theorists of capitalism. Liberty, in the sense of individual autonomy, is not what self-ownership aims to justify. Rather, it aims to justify the denial of liberty, not its exercise. It aims to portray social relationships, primarily wage labor, in which one person commands another, as examples of liberty, rather than what they are, examples of domination and oppression. In other words, self-ownership becomes the means by which the autonomy of the individual is limited, if not destroyed, in the name of freedom and liberty. This is exposed in the right libertarian slogan, "Human rights are property rights." Assuming this is true, it means that you can alienate your rights, rent them, or sell them like any other kind of property. Moreover, if you have no properties, you have no human rights, and you have no place to exercise them. As Ayn Rand, another ideologue for free market capitalism, stated, there can be no such thing as the right to unrestricted freedom of speech or action on someone else's property. From Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. If you are in someone else's property, say at work, you have no basic rights at all beyond the right not to be harmed. A right bosses habitually violate anyway by ignoring health and safety issues. Self-ownership justifies this. You have rented out the property in your person, labor services, and consequently another person can tell you what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Thus, property comes into conflict with liberty. If you argue that human rights are property rights, you automatically ensure that human rights are continually violated in practice simply because there is a conflict between property and liberty. This is not surprising, as the property rights theory of liberty was created to justify the denial of other people's liberty, and the appropriation of their labor. Clearly, then, we reach a problem with self-ownership, or property in the person, once we take into account private property and its distribution. In a nutshell, capitalists don't pay their employees to perform other vital activities listed by Rothbard: learning, valuing, choosing ends and means, unless, of course, the firm requires that the worker undertake such activities in the interests of company profits. Otherwise, workers can rest assured that any efforts to engage in such vital activities on company time will be hampered by coercive molestation. Therefore, wage labor, the basis of capitalism in practice, denies the rights associated with self-ownership, thus alienating the individual from his or her basic rights. Or, as Michael Bakunin expressed it in The worker sells his person and his liberty for a given time under capitalism, in The Political Philosophy of Bakunin. In a society of relative equals, property would not be a source of power as we would co-induce with occupancy. Private property would be replaced by possession. For example, you would still be able to fling a drunk out of your home. But in a system based on wage labor, property is a different thing altogether, becoming a source of institutionalized power and coercive authority through hierarchy. As Noam Chomsky writes, capitalism is based on a particular form of authoritarian control, namely the kind that comes through private ownership and control, which is an extremely rigid system of domination. When property is purely what you as an individual use, possession, it is not a source of power. In capitalism, however, property rights no longer coincide with use rights, so they become a denial of freedom and source of authority and power over the individual. As we've seen in the discussion on hierarchy in sections 2.8 and B.4.2, all forms of authoritarian control depend on coercive molestation, the use of threats or sanctions. This is definitely the case in company hierarchies under capitalism. Bob Black describes the authoritarian nature of capitalism as follows: the place where adults pass the most time and submit to the closest control is at work. Thus, it's apparent that the source of the greatest direct duress expressed by the ordinary adult is not the state, but rather the business that employs him. Your foreman or supervisor gives you more or else orders in a week than the police do in a decade. A libertarian as conservative from the Abolition of Work and other essays. In developing nations, this control can be easily seen to be an utter affront to human dignity and liberty. There, a workplace is often surrounded by barbed wires. Behind its locked doors, workers are supervised by guards who beat and humiliate them over the slightest pretext. Each worker repeats the same action, sewing on a belt loop, stitching a sleeve, maybe 2,000 times a day. They work under painfully bright lights for 12 to 14-hour shifts in overheated factories with too few bathroom breaks and restricted access to water, to reduce the need for more bathroom breaks, which is often foul and unfit for human consumption in any event. Their purpose is to maximize the amount of profit that could be wrung out of the workers, with the time allocated to each task being calculated in units of 10,000ths of a second. From Joe Bacon, The Corporation. While in the developed world, the forms of control are, in general, nowhere as extreme, and things due to hard-won labor, organizing, and struggle, the basic principle is the same. Only a sophist would argue that the workers own themselves and abilities for the period in question. Yet, this is what the advocates of self-ownership do argue. So, by the term self-ownership is meant individual autonomy, then no, capitalism is not based on it. Ironically, the theory of self-ownership is used to undercut and destroy genuine self-ownership during working hours, and potentially elsewhere. The logic is simple. As I own myself, I am therefore able to sell myself as well. Although few advocates of self-ownership are as blunt as this, as we discuss in section F.2.2, right libertarian Robert Nozick accepts that voluntary slavery flows from this principle. Instead, they stress that we own our labor and we contract them to others to use. Yet, unlike other forms of property, labor cannot be alienated. Therefore, when you sell your labor, you sell yourself, your liberty, for the time in question. By alienating your labor power, you alienate the substance of your being, your personality, for the time in question. As such, self-ownership ironically becomes the means of justifying authoritarian social relationships, which deny the autonomy it claims to defend. Instead, these relationships have similarities with slavery, the very thing which it advocates like to contrast self-ownership to. While modern defenders of capitalism deny this, the classical economist James Mill let the cat out of the bag directly by comparing the two. It is worthwhile to quote him at length. The great capitalist, the owner of a manufactory, if he operated with slaves instead of free laborers like the West India planter, would be regarded as owner of both the capital and the labor. He would be the owner, in short, of both instruments of production, and the whole of the produce without participation would be his own. What is the difference in the case of the man who operates by means of laborers receiving wages? The laborer who receives wages sells his labor for a day, a week, a month, or a year, as the case may be. The manufacturer who pays these wages buys the labor for the day, the year, or whatever the period may be. He is equally, therefore, the owner of the labor, which the manufacturer who operates the slaves. The only difference is in the mode of purchasing. The owner of the slave purchases at once the whole of the labor, which the man can ever perform. He who pays wages purchases only so much of a man's labor as he can perform in the day or any other stipulated time. Being equally, however, the owner of the labor, so purchased as the owner of the slave is of the slave, the produce, which is the result of this labor combined with his capital, is all equally his own. In the state of society in which we are present, it is in these circumstances that almost all production is effected. The capitalist is the owner of both instruments of production, and the whole of the produce is his. Elements of political economy, quoted by David Ellerman from Property and Contract in Economics. Thus, the only difference between slavery and capitalist labor is the mode of purchasing. The labor itself and its product in both cases is owned by the great capitalist. Clearly, this is a case of, to use Rothbard's words, during working hours, the worker has little to no right to self-ownership. His person and his produce are systematically expropriated by his master. Little wonder anarchists have tended to call wage labor by the more accurate term, wage slavery. For the duration of the working day, the boss owns the labor power of the worker. As this cannot be alienated from its owner, this means that the boss effectively owns the worker and keeps the product of their labor for the privilege of so doing. There are key differences, of course. At the time, slavery was not a voluntary decision, and the slaves could not change their master. Although in some cultures, such as ancient Rome, people over there could sell themselves in slavery, while voluntary slavery is sanctioned in the Bible. Yet the fact that under wage slavery people are not forced to take a specific job and can change masters does not change the relations of authority created between the two parties. As we know in the next section, the objection that people can leave their jobs just amounts to saying love it or leave it, and does not address the issue at hand. The vast majority of the population cannot avoid wage labor and remain wage workers for most of their adult lives. It is virtually impossible to distinguish being able to sell your liberty or labor piecemeal over a lifetime from alienating your whole lifetime's labor in one go. Changing who you alienate your labor and liberty to does not change the act and experience of alienation. Thus, the paradox of self-ownership. It presupposes autonomy only in order to destroy it. In order to enter a contract, the worker exercises autonomy in deciding whether it is advantageous to rent or sell his or her property, their labor power, for use by another. And given that the alternative is, at best, poverty, unsurprisingly, people do consider it advantageous to consent to the contract. Yet, what is rented or sold is not a piece of property, but rather a self-governing individual. Once the contract is made and the property rights are transferred, they no longer have autonomy and are treated like any other factor of production commodity. In the self-ownership thesis, this is acceptable due to its assumption that people and their labor property are power. Yet the worker cannot send along their labor by itself to an employer. By its very nature, the worker has to be present in the workplace if his property is to be put to use by the person who has bought it. The consequence of contracting out your labor, your property, and the person is that your autonomy, liberty, is restricted, if not destroyed, depending on the circumstances of a particular contract signed. This is because employers hire people, not a piece of property. So far from being based on the right to self-ownership, then, capitalism effectively denies it, alienating the individual from such basic rights as free speech, independent thought, and self-management of one's own activity, which individuals have to give up when they are employed. But since these rights, according to Rothbard, are the product of humans as humans, wage labor alienates them from themselves, exactly as it does the individual's labor power and creativity. For you do not sell your skills, as these skills are a part of you. Instead, what you have to sell is your time, your labor power, and so yourself. Thus, under wage labor, rights of self-ownership are always placed below property rights. The only right left behind to you is that of finding another job. Although even this right is denied in some countries, if the employee owes the company money. It should be stressed that this is not a strange paradox of the self-ownership axiom. Far from it, the doctrine was most famously expounded by John Locke, who expounded that every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right but himself. However, a person can sell, for a certain time, the service he undertakes to do in exchange for wages he is to receive. The buyer of the labor then owns both it and its product. Thus the grass my horse has bit, the turfs my servant has cut, and the ore I have digged in any place where I have the right to them in common with others, becomes my property, without the assignation of consent of anybody. The labor that was mine hath fixed my property in them, from the Second Treatise on Government, Section 27, Section 85, and Section 28. Thus, a person, the servant, becomes the equivalent of an animal, the horse, once they have served their labor to the boss. Wage labor denies the basic humanity and autonomy of the worker. Rather than being equal, anarchists, private property produces relations of domination and alienation. Proudhon compared this to an association in which, while the partnership lasts, the profits and losses are divided between them, since each produces not for himself but for the society. When the time of distribution arrives, it is not the producer who is considered, but the associated. That is why the slave, to whom the planter gives straw and rice, and the civilized labor, to whom the capitalist pays a salary, which is always too small, not being associated with their employers, although producing with them, are disregarded when the product is divided. Thus the horse who draws our coaches produce with us, but are not associated with us. We take their product, but do not share it with them. The animals and laborers whom we employ hold the same relation to us, from what is property. So while the capitalist Locke sees nothing wrong in comparing person to animal, the anarchist Proudhon objects to the fundamental injustice of a system which turns a person to a resource for another to use. And we do mean resource, as the self-ownership thesis is also the means by which the poor become little more than spare parts for the wealthy. After all, the poor own their bodies and consequently can sell an all or part of it to a willing party. This means that someone in dire economic necessity can sell parts of their body to the rich. Ultimately, to tell a poor man that he has property because he has arms and legs, that the hunger from which he suffers and his power to sleep in the open air are his property, is to play upon words and to add insult to injury. Obviously, the ability to labor is not the property of the person, it is their possession. Use and ownership are fused and cannot be separated out. As such, anarchists argue that the history of capitalism shows that there is considerable difference whether one said, like the defenders of capitalism, that slavery is wrong because every person has a natural right to the property of their own body, or because every person has a natural right freely to determine their own destiny, like the anarchists. The first kind of right is alienable, and in the second, and in the context of a capitalist regime, ensures that the many labor for those who own the means of life. The second right is inalienable as long as a person remained a person, and therefore liberty or self-determination is not a claim to ownership, which might be both acquired and surrendered, but an inextricable aspect of the activity of being human. The anarchist position on the inalienable nature of human liberty also forms the basis for the excluded to demand access to the means necessary to labor. From the distinction between possession and property, argued Proudhon, arises two sorts of right: the jus in re, the thing in the thing, and the right by which I may reclaim the property which I have acquired in whatever hands I find it, and jus ad rem, the right to a thing, which gives me a claim to become a proprietor. In the first, possession and property are united. The second includes only naked property. With me, who, as a laborer, have a right to the possession of the products of nature in my own industry, and who, as a proprietor, enjoy none of them, it is by virtue of the jus de rem that I demand admittance to the jus in re. Thus, to make the self-ownership of labor and its products a reality for those who do the actual work in society, rather than a farce, property must be abolished, both in terms of the means of life and also in defining liberty and what it means to be free. So, in contrary to Rothbard's claim, capitalism in practice uses the rhetoric of self-ownership to alienate the right to genuine self-ownership because of the authoritarian structure of the workplace, which derives from private property. If we desire real self-ownership, we cannot renounce it for most of our adult lives by becoming wage slaves. Only worker self-management of production, non-capitalism, can make self-ownership a reality. They speak of inherent rights, inalienable rights, natural rights, etc. Unless the material conditions for equality exist, it is worse than mockery to pronounce men equal. And unless there is equality, and by equality I mean equal chance for everyone to make the most of himself or herself, unless, I say, these equal changes exist, freedom, either of thought, speech, or action, is equally a mockery. As long as the working people tramp the streets, whose stones they lay, whose filth they clean, whose sewers they dig, yet upon which they must not stand too long, lest the policeman bid them move on. As long as they go from factory to factory, begging for the opportunity to be a slave, receiving the insults of bosses and foremen, getting the old shake of the head, in these factories they built, whose machines they wrought, so long as they consent to be herd like cattle in the cities, driven year after year, more and more off the mortgaged land, the land they cleaned, fertilized, cultivated, rendered of value. So long as they continue to do these things vaguely relying upon some power outside of themselves, be it God or priest or politician or employer or charitable society to remedy matters, so long deliverance will be delayed. While they conceive the possibility of a complete international federation of labor, whose constituent groups shall take possession of land, mines, factories, all the instruments of production. In short, conduct their own industry without regulative interference from lawmakers or employers, then we may hope for the only help which counts for all: self-help, the only condition which can guarantee free speech, along with their other rights, and no paper guarantee needed. From the Voltairean Declarator. To conclude, the idea that capitalism is based on self-ownership is radically at odds with reality if, by self-ownership, it is meant self-determination or individual autonomy. However, this is not surprising, given the rationale behind the self-ownership thesis is precisely to justify capitalist hierarchy and its resulting restrictions on liberty. Rather than being a defense to liberty, self-ownership is designed to facilitate its erosion. In order to make the promise of autonomy implied by the concept of self-ownership a reality, private property will need to be abolished. For a discussion of these limitations, contradictions, and fallacies of defining liberty in terms of self-ownership and property rights, see section F.